There is a moment in every marriage where the truth decides it has waited long enough. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't knock. It simply arrives, sometimes quietly, sometimes with the sound of a deadbolt turning, sometimes with 10 black SUVs rolling down a suburban street on a rainy Tuesday night while a man sits on his own porch with a suitcase at his feet and $15 in his wallet. This is that moment. And before this story is over, you are going to question everything you think you know about love, silence, loyalty, and the dangerous space between protecting someone and slowly losing them. Because what happened on Whitmore Drive in Columbus, Ohio did not begin with money. It did not begin with anger. It began the way most heartbreaks begin, with two people who genuinely loved each other, choosing, over and over again, not to say the one thing that might have saved everything. She thought he was poor. She thought he was going nowhere. She thought the man sitting across from her at that kitchen table every morning had nothing to show for 20 years of quiet living. She was wrong. And the night she found out just how wrong she was, standing on her own porch in the cold, watching 10 black SUVs pull away from her street, was the night she understood that the most expensive thing she had ever lost had nothing to do with money at all. Stay with this story. Because it will stay with you. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from right now. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let us get into the story. To understand what happened that Tuesday evening in a quiet neighborhood outside of Columbus, Ohio, you first have to understand who Marcus Webb actually was. Not the man his neighbors thought they knew. Not the man his wife had grown to resent. Not the man who drove the same faded Ford F-150 for 11 years and wore the same worn Carhartt jacket every winter like it was a uniform. But the man underneath all of that. The man he had chosen, very deliberately and with great personal cost, to keep hidden. Because Marcus Webb was not who he appeared to be. And that was not an accident. That was a decision he had made at the age of 36, standing in a hospice room in Akron, Ohio, holding his father's hand while a monitor beeped quietly in the corner and the smell of antiseptic hung in the air like something that had given up trying to be subtle. That decision had shaped every single day of his life since. And it had ultimately shaped the night everything fell apart. Marcus had grown up in Akron in a working-class household that was held together more by habit and stubbornness than by any particular abundance. His father, Robert Webb, had worked for 30 years in a steel fabrication plant on the south side of the city. Robert was the kind of man you did not fully appreciate until you were old enough to understand what it cost to be that steady. He was not a talker. He was not a dreamer. He showed up. He fixed things. He sat on the back steps in the evenings with a cold beer and watched the yard go dark and never seemed to need the world to be more than it was. Marcus used to sit beside him on those steps and wait for him to say something, and sometimes Robert would, and sometimes he wouldn't, and either way it felt like enough. The thing Robert did say, more than once, pressing the cold bottle against his knee and looking out at nothing in particular, was this: "Son, the hardest thing in this world is knowing who's with you because they want to be and who's with you because they have to be." Marcus heard that sentence at 7 years old. He heard it at 14. He heard it at 22, and by then he had started to understand what it meant in a way that was no longer abstract. Because by then, he had watched what happened to his father when the answer to that question turned out to be the wrong one. Robert and Carol Webb had been married for 26 years when things began to change. Marcus was in his late 20s at the time, already building his career, already spending more time in Columbus than Akron. The change in his mother was not dramatic. It was gradual in the way that erosion is gradual, you don't notice it until the ground shifts beneath you. Carol had always been warm, social, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday and made extra food in case someone stopped by. But somewhere in her early 50s she became aware, in a way she had not been before, of a gap between the life she had and the life she saw around her. There was a man at their church, a retired contractor named Willard, who had recently inherited money from an uncle and wore it the way some people wear a new coat, visibly, comfortably, with the quiet confidence of someone who knows they are being noticed. He drove a new truck. He talked about a lake house in Michigan. He took his sister on a cruise for her birthday and mentioned it in the church bulletin. Robert Webb could not compete with that. He never tried to. And Carol, who had spent 26 years loving a man who showed up and fixed things and sat quietly on back steps, found herself, for the first time, measuring that love against something shinier. She left on a spring morning. She packed 2 bags, said she needed something different, and walked out of the house on Maple Street that Robert had paid off 12 years earlier. Robert stayed. He never moved. He never took off his wedding ring. He died 7 years later in that same house, in the same chair he had always sat in, with the same steady quietness that had defined him, as if even at the end he was simply showing up for whatever came next. Marcus held his hand through the last night. He drove back to Columbus the following morning in silence. And somewhere on Route 71, with the flat Ohio farmland stretching out on both sides and the sky doing nothing in particular, he made the promise that would eventually cost him everything he loved. If someone was going to be with him, it would be for him. Not for what he owned. Not for what he had built. For him. He would make sure of it. He just had not yet understood that making sure of it required a kind of honesty he was not ready to give. By the time Marcus was 34, he had already spent a decade working in logistics technology for other companies, learning systems, learning people, learning the specific geography of an industry that most people found too boring to look at closely. He and 2 college friends, a systems engineer named Derek Paulson and a business developer named Chris Hatfield, had been talking for years about an idea. The freight and shipping industry was vast, complicated, and almost comically inefficient in its routing processes. Carriers were losing millions of dollars annually on routes that could be optimized with the right software. The technology existed. The application did not. In the spring of their 34th year, Marcus, Derek, and Chris signed a lease on a small office above a dry cleaner on 4th Street in downtown Columbus, hired 3 people, and started building. The company was called Route Path Systems. Their first client was a regional grocery distributor out of Dayton who was willing to try anything that might cut his fuel costs. It worked. Their second client came 3 months later. Their 5th came 6 months after that. The platform they had built was not glamorous. It was not the kind of technology that got written up in magazines or talked about at dinner parties. It was the kind that quietly saved companies money in ways that showed up in spreadsheets and made operations managers look good. Which meant that word spread exactly the way Marcus had hoped, slowly, steadily, and among exactly the right people. It was also in that 34th year, in the middle of all of that building, that Marcus met Diane. He met her at a birthday party for a mutual friend, a backyard gathering in Westerville on a warm September evening. She was standing near the drink table talking to someone he did not know, and she was laughing at something the person had said, and the laugh was the kind that made Marcus look over from across the yard in the middle of his own conversation. Diane Carmichael was a kindergarten teacher. She drove a 9-year-old Honda Civic with a crack in the dashboard that she had covered with a strip of duct tape and 2 stickers her students had given her. She packed her own lunch every day in the same blue bag. She called her mother every Sunday evening without fail, even when she was tired, even when there was nothing new to say. She had warm brown eyes and a way of paying attention to people that made them feel like the most important person in the room. Marcus fell for her the way quiet men fall, not suddenly, not with fanfare, but completely. Like a tree that leans so gradually toward the light that it does not notice until the angle is irreversible. Their first date was pizza at a place with red checkered tablecloths and a jukebox that had not worked since 2003. She ordered the same thing he did without asking what he was getting. He thought that meant something. Maybe it did. They were married 18 months later at a park pavilion in Westerville with 40 guests and a caterer who mixed up the dessert order and brought lemon cake instead of chocolate, and nobody cared. Diane's mother wept through the entire ceremony, including the parts that were not particularly emotional. Robert Webb, who had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's the year before and whose hands had begun their slow betrayal, stood at the altar beside his son and was straighter that afternoon than Marcus had seen him in years. It was a simple wedding. A genuinely happy one. The kind where the photographs look like real life because they are. And the years that followed were built on the same foundation, simple, genuine, real. They bought a house in a suburb called Westgate Hills, a 3-bedroom colonial on a street called Whitmore Drive with a backyard that got good afternoon light and a kitchen that was slightly too small for two people who both liked to cook. They argued about small things and made up quickly. They talked about having children for several years, and when it became clear it was not going to happen, they found a way to mourn that quietly and then find each other again on the other side of it. They were, by most reasonable measures, a happy couple. And Marcus, watching his wife move through their shared life with her warmth and her steadiness and her Sunday phone calls to her mother, told himself that what he had built was real. That she was with him for him. That his father's question had been answered. What he did not tell himself, what he refused to examine too closely, was that the answer was built on incomplete information. Because Diane did not know who she had married. Not fully. She knew Marcus ran a software company. She knew it was doing well enough. She knew he worked hard and kept odd hours and sometimes took calls that seemed important without explaining who they were with. She did not know that by 2014, RoutePath Systems had over 300 enterprise clients. She did not know about the 2 Fortune 500 companies on their roster. She did not know that the company had been restructured as a private holding entity, or that Marcus's share of the profits flowed through a series of legal trusts that had been carefully constructed by a team of attorneys Marcus had hired specifically to keep his financial life quiet and protected. She did not know that the modest annual salary Marcus drew from the company was a choice, a deliberate, considered choice, to live in a way that told no story he had not approved. She did not know that the old Ford F-150 in the driveway was not a necessity but a preference. She did not know that the house on Whitmore Drive had been placed in her name 3 years into their marriage as a quiet, private act of protection that he had never mentioned to her. She did not know any of it. And Marcus, standing behind the wall he had built and calling it love, had convinced himself that not knowing was the same as not needing to know. Silence, he had told himself, was safety. What he had not understood was that silence, over years, does not stay neutral. It accumulates. It takes on weight and texture and eventually a smell. It begins to look like distance. And distance, in a marriage, begins to look like indifference. And indifference, even the appearance of it, is its own kind of abandonment. Think about that for a moment. Think about the relationships in your own life, the marriages you have watched, the partnerships you have been part of, and ask yourself how many of them were damaged not by cruelty or betrayal but by the slow, compounding weight of things never said. How many conversations were put off because the timing wasn't right, because it seemed easier to let it go, because saying the true thing out loud felt more dangerous than carrying it quietly. Marcus Webb was not a cruel man. He was not a dishonest man in the way the word is usually meant. He was a man who had been so badly hurt by what silence had done to his father that he had built his entire emotional architecture around preventing it from happening to him, and in doing so, had used silence as the primary building material. The shift in Diane did not happen overnight. It happened the way weather changes in Ohio, gradually, then all at once, with a quality of inevitability that makes it hard to say exactly when the sky changed color. In the early years she had not thought much about the financial details of their life together. They had what they needed. The bills were paid. The house was theirs. Marcus always said things were fine and she had believed him because there was no specific reason not to, and because she was busy with her own work, and because love, when it is working, tends to fill in the gaps without asking too many questions. But somewhere around the time she turned 48, Diane began to feel the gaps. She began to notice the distance between the life she was living and the lives she saw accumulating around her. It was not envy exactly. It was more like a growing unease. A sense that the next chapter of her life was approaching and she had not prepared for it and did not know what it would look like, and was becoming afraid that the answer was that it would look exactly like this chapter, unchanged and unresolved, until it simply ended. Her friend Rachel had married a financial advisor named Todd who was not particularly interesting but was meticulously organized about money in a way that meant Rachel talked about things like their projected retirement income and their investment portfolio and their plan to travel for 6 months after Todd turned 60 with the casual confidence of someone who knows exactly where they are going. Diane listened to these conversations and felt something she could not entirely name, not jealousy of Rachel, but a kind of longing for the thing underneath the financial planning, which was the feeling of being seen and accounted for. Of being in a partnership where both people knew where things stood. The Carters across the street remodeled their kitchen and bought a new Lexus SUV and took a trip to Portugal and came back with photographs they shared at a neighborhood gathering. Diane looked at the photographs and smiled and said all the right things and drove home afterward and sat in the driveway of her own house for 4 minutes without going inside. She started asking Marcus different kinds of questions. Not accusatory ones. Careful ones. The kind that were really requests for reassurance dressed in the language of practicality. Do you think we should talk to a financial advisor? Marcus would nod and say he had things managed. What does retirement actually look like for us? He would say something about it being further away than she thought and not to worry. Are we on track for where we should be at our age? He would look at her with that steady, patient expression that she had once found deeply comforting and that she now found, increasingly, like a door being closed in her face. Not unkindly. But closed. Every question met with reassurance that contained no information. Every concern acknowledged and then gently redirected. She was not being lied to. She was being managed. And she was beginning to understand the difference. There was a Sunday evening in March, about 8 months before everything came to a head, that Diane remembered for a long time afterward. She had been thinking about what she wanted to say for several days. She had rehearsed it in the car, in the shower, while walking the neighborhood in the evenings. She sat down across from Marcus at the kitchen table after dinner, with the dishes still stacked in the drying rack and the evening news murmuring from the living room, and she told him what she needed to say. She told him she felt invisible in their financial life. She told him she felt like a tenant in her own marriage, living in it, paying into it, but not part of the decisions, not part of the picture. She told him she was 51 years old and she was scared of getting old without knowing where they stood, and that the fear was not about luxury or keeping up with anyone, it was about not feeling alone in her own partnership. She looked at him across the table and she meant every word of it. Marcus looked back at her. He opened his mouth. He had the truth right there, all of it, everything, the company, the trusts, the acquisition discussions, the house in her name, all of it ready to come out. He could feel it. And then something in him sealed it back. The old fear, the old promise, the old architecture of protection kicked in before he could stop it. He said the things he always said. That she didn't need to worry. That he had things handled. That everything was going to be fine. Diane looked at him for a long moment after he finished speaking. Then she nodded slowly and got up and went to do the dishes. And the moment passed. And with it, something that could not be entirely recovered. Over the next 8 months the temperature in the house dropped in increments so small that Marcus kept telling himself things were fine, that she was busy, that it was a phase, that it would pass. He was wrong on all counts. Diane had begun a quiet, private reckoning. She talked to her sister more. She talked to Rachel more. She sat with her thoughts in a way she had not done in years, turning over the contours of her marriage and looking at them honestly. She started going through their shared financial documents on evenings when Marcus was on calls. Not because she suspected anything criminal. Because she wanted to understand. What she found confused her more than it clarified. There was a company. There were accounts. There were documents that referenced structures she did not understand and attorneys she had never heard of and trust agreements that seemed to say things she could not fully interpret. She called a family attorney in November. Just to understand, she told herself. Just to get clarity. The attorney advised her to gather what she could and come in for a consultation in the new year. The consultation happened on a Thursday in January. The attorney, a composed woman named Patricia Ellison who had been handling family law for 22 years, looked at the documents Diane had brought and told her that the picture was incomplete, that without full financial disclosure it was difficult to say exactly what was there, but that what she could see suggested the company had been structured carefully and deliberately in a way that predated the marriage. She told Diane that her situation was more complicated than it appeared and that she should think carefully about what she wanted before taking any steps. Diane drove home from that meeting and sat in the driveway of the house on Whitmore Drive for a long time. She looked at the house. She looked at the yard. She thought about 11 years of dinners and arguments and quiet evenings and a man who always said things were fine but never once showed her what fine looked like. And she made a decision that felt, in the moment, like the only decision available to her. She did not do it in anger. That was the thing Marcus remembered most clearly afterward, not screaming, not accusations, not the theatrical collapse of a marriage that he might have found easier to process. She did it in the terrifying calm of someone who has moved past emotion into something more like resolve. She put his clothes in his suitcase on a Sunday afternoon while he was on a call in the office, folded them the way she always folded his clothes, set the suitcase on the porch, and when he came out and found it there she stood in the doorway and told him she needed him to go. She told him she had tried to reach him in that marriage 100 times and every time she had hit a wall she could not see through or around. She told him she didn't know who he was in this life they had built together and that not knowing, after 11 years, was more than she could carry. She told him she was sorry. And then she stepped back inside and closed the door. The deadbolt turned. The porch light stayed on. And Marcus Webb sat down on the steps of the house where he had lived for 11 years, in the rain, with his suitcase beside him and $15 in his wallet and the weight of every conversation he had never been willing to have. The street was quiet in the way suburban streets are quiet at that hour, not silent, but settled. A dog was barking somewhere on the next block. The Carters' living room light cast a pale rectangle onto their front lawn. A car passed slowly at the far end of the street and turned and was gone. Marcus sat and listened to the rain and did not move for a while. He was not thinking about the company. He was not thinking about the acquisition. He was thinking about a kitchen table in March, and a woman sitting across from it with tired eyes and a careful voice, and the moment he had chosen to close the door when she had been asking him to open it. He was thinking about his father. He was thinking about the way Robert Webb had sat on those back steps in the evenings and seemed, in his stillness, to understand something about the cost of pride that Marcus had apparently needed to learn the hard way. He was thinking that wisdom inherited is not the same as wisdom earned, and that you can spend your whole life trying not to become one thing and end up becoming something just as costly. He turned his phone over in his hand. The screen lit up with the same notification it had been showing for 3 days. Missed calls from a contact saved as Board Chairman, Raymond Holt. Route Path Systems had been in acquisition negotiations for 11 months. A private equity group out of Chicago called Meridian Capital Partners had made an offer that the board considered serious. The number on the table was substantial. The board had been patient, but patience had its limits, and the signing window on the deal structure was narrowing. Raymond Holt had called Marcus 4 times in 3 days. Marcus had not called back. Not because he did not care about the deal. But because the deal had felt, in the context of everything else happening, like a problem that belonged to a version of his life he had not yet decided to inhabit. There, on the porch steps in the rain, with the door locked behind him and nowhere particular to go, he decided. He called Raymond back. Raymond answered on the first ring. There was the sound of an office in the background, the low hum of a room where things were happening. Marcus. The relief in Raymond's voice was the kind that only comes after several days of sustained anxiety. Thank God. I was starting to plan for the worst. Marcus said he was sorry for the delay. Raymond said it did not matter, that the deal was done, that Meridian had finalized the terms that morning and the valuation had closed at $480 million and that the board needed him present for the signing. Where are you? Raymond asked. Marcus told him. There was a pause. We have a convoy already coordinated to bring you to the signing location. They were staged nearby. I can redirect them to your address right now. Another pause, quieter. Marcus, are you all right? Marcus looked at the rain coming down on Whitmore Drive. He thought about all right for a moment. Send them, he said. He hung up. He set the phone on the step beside him and sat in the quiet for another minute, listening to the rain, and let himself feel the full weight of what was happening. $480 million. 20 years of work. A company built from a leased office above a dry cleaner. And the man who had built it was sitting on a porch with a suitcase in the rain because the one person who had lived beside that building for 11 years had never been told the truth about what it was. He did not feel victorious. He felt the way a person feels when something that was supposed to mean everything arrives at the exact moment when they understand that meaning was never the problem. Now stop for a moment and sit with that. Because this is the part of the story that people do not talk about when they talk about success. The part where everything you worked for arrives exactly on schedule and the room where you wanted to celebrate it is empty. If that was you, if the night your greatest professional achievement was confirmed was also the night you were sitting alone in the rain with a locked door behind you, what would you have felt? Would the number have meant anything? Or would it have been the loneliest moment of your life? If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment with the words, "I am still here." Let us see who is truly following this story, because what happens next on Whitmore Drive is something that none of those neighbors ever forgot. The first headlight appeared at the far end of Whitmore Drive about 12 minutes after Marcus ended the call. Then a second. Then 5. Then 10. A man named Greg Okafor, who lived directly across the street from the Webb house and had been watching the neighborhood's quiet dramas with mild interest for 4 years, later told people that he had been standing at his upstairs bedroom window with a glass of water when he saw the lights and thought at first it was a funeral procession that had taken a wrong turn. 10 black SUVs. Moving in a single, unhurried line. Turning carefully onto Whitmore Drive and filling the curb in front of number 44 with a precision that seemed slightly too organized for a residential street on a rainy Tuesday night. They did not use sirens. They did not rush. They simply arrived the way serious things arrive, without apology and without explanation, as if their presence were the only comment necessary. The drivers stayed in their vehicles with the engines running. For a moment nothing happened. The street was still except for the rain and the low idle of 10 engines and Greg Okafor across the street forgetting that he was still holding a glass of water. Then the door of the lead SUV opened and Raymond Holt stepped out. 62 years old, silver-haired, wearing a dark wool overcoat that had cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments, Raymond was the kind of man who had been in enough important rooms that ordinary rooms no longer affected his posture. He walked directly to Marcus, who was still sitting on the porch steps, and extended his hand. "Marcus. I am genuinely sorry for the timing." He said it the way people say things when they mean them and know that meaning them is not enough. 3 other men in suits stepped out of the second SUV. 2 carried leather document folders. 1 carried a laptop in a slim case. Marcus stood slowly, picked up his suitcase, still sitting there, still carrying the quiet humiliation of having been packed by someone else, and shook Raymond's hand. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Raymond looked at him and understood enough. By this point the neighborhood had noticed. Porch lights were on up and down Whitmore Drive. Curtains had shifted in 3 of the nearest windows. Greg Okafor had put down his water glass and come downstairs and was now standing on his own porch in a t-shirt despite the rain, watching with the focused attention of a man who understands that he is witnessing something he will be describing for years. 2 doors down, an elderly woman named Vera had opened her front door and was peering out from behind her screen door with an expression of careful neutrality that suggested she was already preparing a version of events to share with her daughter. The street had become, in the space of 12 minutes, a different kind of place than it had been. And then the front door of number 44 opened. Diane stood in the doorway. She was wearing her gray cardigan, the one with the pocket on the left side that she always kept a folded tissue in, and her arms were crossed against the cold and her face was doing something complicated and difficult to read. She looked at the street. She looked at the 10 black SUVs and the men in suits and the silver-haired man in the wool overcoat and her husband standing on the bottom porch step with his suitcase in his hand. She looked at all of it for several seconds without speaking, the way a person looks at something when their brain is working much faster than their expression. Then she said his name. Marcus. Quiet. Careful. The way you say a name when you are not sure yet what question you are asking. He turned and looked at her. There was no anger in his face and no triumph. There was something more complicated and more honest than either of those things, the expression of a man who has run out of ways to avoid a moment and is simply standing in it. "What is this?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment in the rain. "It's work," he said. Raymond Holt took a small, tactful step back and said something quiet to the men with him. Marcus walked to the bottom step of the porch and stopped close enough that he did not have to raise his voice. "You said you didn't know who I was in this marriage," he said. He was not accusing her. He was not performing anything. He was just saying a true thing, in the same way his father used to say true things, without decoration, without the expectation that the other person owed him a particular response. "I should have told you a long time ago. That's on me. I'm sorry I didn't." Diane looked at him. Her arms were still crossed. Her face had moved from complicated to something closer to grief. Not the dramatic grief of a scene but the quieter grief of a person who is beginning to understand the full shape of something they have already lost. Marcus turned away. He walked to the lead SUV. The door was opened for him by a young man in a dark suit who did not make eye contact. Marcus got in. He set his suitcase on the seat beside him. The door closed. And 10 black SUVs pulled away from Whitmore Drive in the same single, unhurried line in which they had arrived, turned at the end of the street, and were gone. Diane stood on the porch until the last set of tail lights disappeared. The rain was still falling. Greg Okafor was still on his porch across the street. The elderly woman Vera had closed her screen door but had not yet turned off her porch light. The street was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than it had been before, the kind that comes after something, not before. Diane turned around and went back inside. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway of the house for a moment with her hand still on the doorknob, and the house, which she had lived in for 11 years, felt in that moment like the inside of a question she did not know how to answer. She went to the kitchen. She filled the kettle. She stood at the counter and waited for it to boil and looked out the window at the backyard where the rain was falling on the small concrete patio and the 2 wooden chairs they had put out 3 summers ago and never quite got around to replacing when they started to look weathered. She stood there for a long time. The kettle boiled. She did not move. What happened next did not happen neatly or quickly. It happened the way things happen after a marriage reaches its turning point, slowly, with a lot of paperwork and a lot of silence and a lot of lying awake at 3 in the morning trying to remember the order in which things went wrong. Diane called Patricia Ellison, the family attorney, the following morning. She told her what had happened. She said she needed to understand what she was entitled to. Patricia told her to gather everything she could and come in at the end of the week. Diane arrived at Patricia's office on a Friday afternoon with a folder of documents and a composure she had assembled carefully since Tuesday and was holding together with some effort. Patricia reviewed what she had. Then she told Diane something she had not expected. The house on Whitmore Drive, Patricia said, was already in Diane's name. Had been for 8 years. Marcus had placed it there as part of his estate planning and had done it without notifying her, without any fanfare, without apparent expectation of credit or acknowledgement. It was simply hers. Beyond that, Patricia explained, the company and its associated trust structures had been established years before their marriage. The legal architecture was complex but clear, there was very little that Diane could claim as marital property under Ohio law. But here was the thing that stopped Diane cold when Patricia said it, Marcus had not made any counter-moves. His attorney had sent a single, brief letter stating that he intended no contest on shared assets and was making no claims against Diane's property. He was not fighting. He was not positioning. He had simply handed her everything he could hand her and walked away. Diane sat with that in Patricia's office for a moment without speaking. She thought about the house. She thought about the fact that he had put it in her name 8 years ago and never once used it as leverage, never mentioned it during any of their arguments, never held it over her head even in the moments when things were difficult and he would have had every right to point to it and say something. She thought about 11 years of a man who said things were fine and she now understood had the means to make them better than fine and had chosen not to show her. And she sat in the fluorescent light of a family attorney's office on a Friday afternoon and felt the full, uncomfortable weight of a story she had been telling herself about her marriage that was missing several important chapters. She drove home. She did not call Rachel. She did not call her sister. She sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea that went cold and looked out the window at the backyard and the rain and the 2 wooden chairs that needed replacing and tried to figure out what she actually felt underneath everything else. What she felt, she admitted to herself eventually, was grief. Not for what she had lost, but for what had never been said, all the years of conversations that had happened in the wrong language, all the evenings she had felt invisible when the truth was that she had been protected in ways she could not see, all the moments when 2 people who genuinely cared for each other had chosen the wrong form of silence at the wrong time and watched the distance grow between them without understanding that they were both making it. Marcus, meanwhile, was in Chicago. The signing took 2 days. It happened in a conference room on the 38th floor of a building in the Loop, with a view of Lake Michigan that was genuinely impressive even on a gray February morning. The documents were thick. The handshakes were formal. Photographs were taken. A bottle of something expensive was opened that Marcus took 1 sip of and then quietly set down on the credenza behind him. He was present for all of it and somewhere else for most of it. Raymond noticed. Everyone noticed. Nobody said anything because the check had already been written and the documents had already been signed and some things are understood without being said. Marcus declined the dinner that was offered afterward. He went back to his hotel room, a nice room on the 22nd floor, and ordered a burger from room service and found a baseball game on television that he watched for 3 innings before falling asleep in his clothes with the room light still on. He woke at 4 in the morning, looked at the ceiling, thought about Whitmore Drive, and did not go back to sleep. He flew back to Columbus the following afternoon. He did not go to the house. He checked into a hotel near the airport that he had no connection to and spent 4 days there, ordering food, taking calls, handling the follow-up items from the closing. On the 5th day he signed a short-term lease on a 1-bedroom apartment on the west side of Columbus, in a building that overlooked the Scioto River. The apartment was on the 11th floor. It had large windows and very little furniture and the kind of uncluttered silence that belongs to places that have not yet accumulated a life. He moved in over the course of an afternoon. He unpacked his suitcase, the same suitcase Diane had packed and left on the porch, hung his clothes in the small closet, put his toiletries in the bathroom, and set his laptop on the kitchen counter. He made a pot of coffee in the coffee maker that came with the apartment. He stood at the window and watched the river. The city moved around it, indifferent and continuous, the way cities do. He stood there for a while and let himself feel the particular quality of starting over at 53, which is different from starting over at 30 and different again from never having had to start over at all. He did not call Diane. He did not contact her attorney. His own attorney, a careful man named Frank Boyle who had been handling Marcus's affairs for 16 years, managed the legal correspondence on his behalf. The position Marcus had instructed Frank to take was simple: no contest, no claims. Whatever was hers was hers. Frank had raised an eyebrow at this, the practiced eyebrow of a man who had spent a career watching people make emotionally driven decisions with legal consequences. Marcus had told him it was not emotional. It was accurate. Frank had nodded and drafted the letter. The letter went to Patricia Ellison's office and from there, presumably, to Diane. Marcus did not wait to hear how she reacted to it. He had not done it to produce a reaction. He had done it because it was the right thing and because the house had always been hers, whether she knew it or not, and because whatever had gone wrong in that marriage was not something that could be fixed or compensated for with legal maneuvering. 2 months after the night on the porch, Marcus sat down at the kitchen counter of his apartment with a legal pad and a pen and wrote Diane a letter. Not a typed email. Not a message through attorneys. A handwritten letter on plain white paper, the kind of letter that takes time and intention and cannot be dashed off in a moment of impulse. He wrote for a long time. He wrote about his father. He wrote about Robert Webb on the back steps in the evenings, and the question that had shaped Marcus's entire emotional life, and what he had understood from it and what he had gotten wrong. He wrote about the promise he had made in the hospice room and what it had cost him and what it had cost them. He wrote about the acquisitions and the trusts and the house in her name and all the things he had kept quiet in the name of protection and only now understood had been a form of distance dressed up as care. And near the end he wrote the sentence that he had been carrying for the better part of 2 months, the sentence that had arrived at him fully formed somewhere on the westbound side of Route 71 on the drive back from his father's funeral and had never quite found the right moment to be said out loud. I never needed you to be impressed by what I had. I needed you to believe in me when there was nothing to be impressed by. That was the only test that ever mattered to me. And I think in the end we both failed it, not because we were bad people, but because we never told each other what we were actually afraid of. He folded the letter, put it in an envelope, wrote the address on Whitmore Drive in his careful handwriting, and mailed it at the post office on his corner. He did not wait for a response. He did not expect one. Diane received the letter on a Thursday. She recognized his handwriting on the envelope immediately and stood at the mailbox on the front walk for a moment before opening it. She read it at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, reading slowly, the way you read something you understand you will not be able to unread. She read it a second time. Then she set it on the table and looked out the window at the backyard and the 2 wooden chairs that were still there, more weathered now, the paint peeling at the edges of the armrests. She had never replaced them. She thought about replacing them and then every time something had come up and it had not happened and now here they still were, the same chairs, more worn, still occupying the same corner of the patio. She thought about that for a long time without being entirely sure why. Then she folded the letter carefully and put it in the kitchen drawer where she kept things she was not ready to throw away, old birthday cards, a photograph from a trip they had taken to the Outer Banks in 2016, a note her mother had written her the year she started teaching. She closed the drawer. She finished her tea. She called her sister that evening and talked until 1 in the morning, going around and around the same questions without arriving at answers that felt complete, and her sister, who had always been the kind of honest that was occasionally painful, said near the end of the call, "Diane, I think you both hurt each other. I don't think either of you meant to. I think you were both so afraid of the wrong thing that you missed the actual thing until it was too late." Diane sat with that on the phone in her kitchen for a long moment. Then she said, "Yeah." Then they said goodnight. The divorce was finalized 7 months after the night on the porch. It was, by the standards of these things, quiet. No courtroom arguments. No contested assets beyond a few shared accounts that were divided without drama. The house remained in Diane's name, as it always had been. She kept it. Marcus wanted her to. She stayed on Whitmore Drive. She kept teaching. She kept calling her mother on Sundays. She went back to being who she was before and found that she was, in certain ways that surprised her, more herself than she had been in years, as if the grief of ending something had cleared out a space that had been cluttered for a long time. She did not speak about Marcus publicly. She did not post about it or discuss it in ways that invited commentary. She kept her counsel the way private people do. But in the quiet of the house on evenings after school, she thought about him more than she expected to. Not with longing, exactly. With something more complicated. With the particular kind of tenderness you have for a person you loved who hurt you in ways that were not entirely their fault, whom you also hurt in ways that were not entirely yours. Marcus, for his part, began to build a different kind of life in the apartment overlooking the Scioto River. He took on no new major business ventures in the first year. He helped Derek and Chris manage the transition to Meridian Capital's ownership of Route Path, attending board meetings and answering the questions that only he could answer, and then gradually stepping back from those too. He found that he had more time than he had had in 20 years and that he did not entirely know what to do with it, which struck him as both sad and instructive. He started running in the mornings along the river path. He started cooking real meals instead of ordering everything. He called his college friends more. He sat on his balcony in the evenings and watched the river and let the quiet be quiet, without trying to fill it with work or planning. And about 9 months after the night on the porch, he walked into a community college on the east side of Columbus and asked about their entrepreneurship mentorship program. The director, a practical woman in her 40s who had been running the program on minimal funding for 6 years, looked at him across her desk and said they were always looking for people with real experience and asked what kind of experience he had. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can you start Tuesday?" He showed up that Tuesday evening in his ordinary clothes, dark jeans, a flannel shirt, the kind of outfit that told no stories, and sat down at a folding table across from a group of 20-year-olds with ideas and no roadmap and the particular combination of ambition and uncertainty that belongs to people who want to build something and have not yet learned how long it actually takes. He told them about Route Path. He told them the whole story this time: the dry cleaner office, the first client, the 3 employees, the years of being boring and invisible and doing the work before anyone outside the company had any reason to care. He told them it would look like nothing for longer than felt bearable. He told them the people around them might not see it. He told them the specific loneliness of building something quietly in a world that rewards loudness. And then he told them the thing he had spent 53 years learning the hardest possible way: talk to the people you love. Tell them the truth, even when the truth is complicated, even when you are afraid of what knowing it might do to them, even when the silence feels safer. Because the silence is not safer. It is just slower. Diane went back to her classroom every morning and stood in front of 22 5-year-olds who needed her attention and her patience and her ability to make the world feel safe and manageable, and she gave them all of that with the particular dedication of a person who has found that throwing themselves into the work they love is the best available answer to a grief they are still processing. In the fall, about 10 months after the night on the porch, she took a week off that she had never managed to take before and drove to the coast of Maine by herself. She stayed at a small inn near the water in a town called Rockport that her mother had mentioned once, years ago, as a place she had always wanted to go. She walked on the beach in the mornings when the light was still low and the air had the specific cold clarity that New England fall mornings have. She read in the afternoons. She sat on the inn's small porch in the evenings with a glass of wine and watched the water and let herself be quiet in a way that felt, for the first time in a long time, like her own choice. She came home on a Friday evening and walked into the house on Whitmore Drive and stood in the kitchen and felt, for the first time since the deadbolt turned, that the house was hers in a way that had nothing to do with whose name was on the deed. She was home. She did not know yet exactly what she was building. But she knew it was hers to build. 14 months after the night on the porch, Marcus called Diane. He had not planned to call. He had been sitting on his balcony on a Sunday evening watching the river in the particular gold light that the Scioto gets in late October when it decided for him. She answered after 3 rings. There was a pause on both ends, the kind of pause that contains 11 years of shared life and 7 months of legal proceedings and 2 people who do not quite know yet which version of themselves is talking to which version of the other. He asked if she would be willing to meet for coffee. Not to revisit anything, he said. Just to close something properly, in person, the way things that mattered deserved to be closed. She said yes. They met at a coffee shop on the north side of Columbus on a Tuesday afternoon, not a place either of them had been to before, a neutral place with no associations, with exposed brick and a chalkboard menu and the low murmur of other people having other conversations around them. They sat across from each other for 2 hours. They talked about the early years. They talked about the Park Pavilion wedding and Diane's mother weeping through every moment of it and the caterer who brought lemon cake. They talked about the vegetable garden in the backyard that they had planted the first summer in the house with genuine enthusiasm and then failed to water adequately and had watched die by August. They laughed about the vegetable garden, which surprised both of them. They talked about the things they had not said to each other and why they had not said them, with an honesty that had not been available to either of them when it would have been most useful. Diane told him she was sorry for the way she had handled it, not for needing something to change, but for closing the door the way she did, in the rain, without giving the truth a chance to come out before she decided. Marcus told her he was sorry for making silence into a form of protection and then wondering why she felt alone. He told her about his father. He told her the whole story this time, all of it, in the way he should have told her years ago in the kitchen on a Sunday evening when she had asked him who he was in their marriage and he had been too afraid to answer. She listened. She did not cry. She looked at him with the warm brown eyes that had made him look across a backyard at a birthday party in Westerville 20 years ago and felt the specific sadness of understanding something completely only after it is over. When they stood up to leave, she hugged him once, briefly, with the kind of hug that means goodbye in the fullest sense of the word. They walked out separately into the gray October afternoon and went back to their separate lives, and that was the end of the story of Marcus and Diane Webb as a married couple. But it was not, quite, the end of the story of who they were to each other. Some people you love become part of the architecture of who you are in ways that do not go away when the relationship does. They simply change shape. They become the reason you tell certain truths you might otherwise keep. They become the thing you think of when someone you are trying to help is about to make the same mistake you made. They become, in the end, a kind of wisdom, expensive and hard-won and worth more than any number that can be written on a closing document in a conference room on the 38th floor. So let us talk about what this story is actually about. Because it is not about money. It was never about money. The $480 million and the 10 black SUVs and the moment on Whitmore Drive that Greg Okafor talked about for the better part of a year at neighborhood gatherings, all of that was backdrop. All of that was the surface of a much older, much quieter story. It was about a man who watched love leave his father because his father had nothing to show for himself and decided so completely to prevent that from happening again that he built a wall and called it love and did not notice until too late that his wife was on the other side of it, knocking. It was about a woman who spent 11 years feeling invisible in her own partnership and eventually made the only move she felt she had, without knowing that the invisibility was never the truth, just the shape the truth had been allowed to take by two people who were both afraid of different things. It was about all the conversations that happen in the wrong language. All the moments where two people sit across from each other at a kitchen table and talk around the center of the thing they are both actually trying to say. All the ways we protect ourselves from the risk of being known and then wonder why we feel alone. And this is the part where we want to talk to you directly. Because this story is not rare. It is not the story of two exceptional people in an exceptional situation. It is the story that happens every day in ordinary houses on ordinary streets in every city in this country, with different names and different details and the same essential center. The question at the heart of it is one that most of us have had to sit with at some point. How much do you show the person you love? How much do you trust them with? And when you have held something back for so long that the holding has become a habit, how do you find your way back to the truth before the distance becomes permanent? We want to ask you something. Not rhetorically. Really. If you were Diane, if you had spent 11 years in a marriage where you felt financially invisible, where every question was met with reassurance but never information, where you could feel something was being kept from you but could not name it, would you have done what she did? Or would you have pushed harder for the truth before making a move you could not take back? And if you were Marcus, if you had built something extraordinary in silence because you needed to know the person beside you was there for you and not for what you had, at what point would you have let her in? At what point does protection become its own kind of betrayal? There is no clean answer to either question. That is the honest truth. This is a story without a villain. It is a story about two people who were both trying to protect themselves from real fears and who managed, in the process, to protect themselves right out of something they both genuinely wanted to keep. The lesson it leaves is not simple. It does not reduce to a single sentence. But if it reduces to anything, it might be this: the people you love cannot see through walls. No matter how good your reasons for building them. Marcus Webb is still in Columbus. He still shows up on Tuesday evenings at the community college in his ordinary clothes. He still drives a truck, though it is a newer one now. He made that concession to practicality and still feels slightly strange about it. He still prefers to be in rooms where no one knows who he is or what he has. He has learned, slowly and imperfectly, to talk more. To answer the question when someone asks him who he is. To understand that being known is not the same as being vulnerable, and that the risk of it is worth taking. He is not at peace with everything that happened. He does not think he should be. But he is honest about it in a way he was not before, and that is the kind of peace that actually lasts. Diane is still teaching. Her classroom walls are covered in the artwork of 22 5-year-olds who think she is remarkable, and on the evidence, they are correct. She still calls her mother on Sunday evenings. She still drives a Honda. She replaced the 2 wooden chairs on the patio last spring, finally, with 2 new ones that she picked out herself, exactly the style she wanted, without consulting anyone. She put them in the same corner. Some things you keep in the same place even when everything around them has changed. It feels right. It is right. Because not everything from before needs to be discarded. Some things were genuinely good. Some things were genuinely worth having. And knowing the difference, being honest enough with yourself to know what to keep and what to release, is maybe the most important thing any of us ever learn to do. On Whitmore Drive, things have mostly gone back to normal. Greg Okafor still watches the neighborhood from his upstairs window, though he will tell you himself that nothing has quite matched that Tuesday in February. The Carters got a new car, a different one this time, a hybrid. Vera, the elderly woman 2 doors down, still turns her porch light on in the evenings. The house at number 44 still has its 3 bedrooms and its slightly too small kitchen and its backyard that gets good afternoon light. The 2 new wooden chairs on the patio can be seen from the street in the summer, when the gate is open. The street is quiet. It is ordinary. It is exactly what it appears to be, and nothing more. And somewhere in all of that ordinariness is the part of this story that matters most. Not the convoy. Not the acquisition. Not the legal filings or the conference room or the hotel in Chicago or the gold light on the Scioto River in October. The part that matters most is a kitchen table in March and a woman with tired eyes asking the person she married to let her in. And a man who almost said the true thing and then didn't. And everything that followed from that one moment of chosen silence. That is the story. That is always the story. So here is what we want to leave you with. Whose side do you find yourself on, Marcus, who protected what he built because he had seen what happened when love was conditional on wealth? Or Diane, who needed to feel like a real partner in her own marriage and eventually demanded it? Or do you believe, as this story does, that they were both right and both wrong in equal measure and that the real failure belonged to neither of them alone but to all the years of conversations that never quite reached the center of what they were really about? Write it in the comments below. Tell us what moved you. Tell us what you would have done differently. Tell us if this story reminded you of something in your own life, because that is exactly what it was meant to do. And if it moved you, if it stayed with you the way the real ones do, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the most important thing a story can do is make one person turn to another person and say the thing they have been not saying for too long. That is worth more than 10 convoys on any street. If you enjoyed this story and want more like it, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss what we bring next. We will see you in the next one.